Welcome to the channel. Here we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, a fascinating look at how our behavior, emotions, and habits shape the way we earn, spend, and think about wealth. If you enjoy clear, thought-provoking breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
I want you to imagine for a second that you walk into a hospital, right? And you need a complex, life-saving heart transplant.
Oh, wow. Okay, high stakes right out of the gate.
Yeah, exactly. So you're lying there on the gurney, the lights are super bright, the monitors are, beeping, and the hospital administrator comes in to introduce your surgeon.
Right, you're expecting the chief of cardiology or someone like that.
Exactly. But it's not the chief of cardiology who walks in. It's the guy who's been mopping the floors in the lobby for the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying.
Right. And the administrator looks at you just completely deadpan and says, "Don't worry. His surgical outcomes have actually massively outperformed our Harvard-trained doctors."
I mean, I would jump off the table. Security would be called immediately.
I would literally tear the IV out of my arm and run out of the building.
Because it defies every single logical expectation we have about expertise, right? About rigorous education and, frankly, just how the professional world works.
It's completely absurd. Or, picture the same thing with a nuclear power plant.
Oh, a gas station attendant just strolling into the control room.
Exactly. Pushes aside the MIT-educated nuclear physicists and somehow engineers a better, safer, more efficient reactor.
Right, which is literally impossible. It sounds like a sketch comedy premise.
It really does. But then, and this is why we're here today, you step into the world of finance.
Right, where the rules just completely change.
Yes. You step into the realm of investing, of personal wealth, of global markets, and suddenly, that exact scenario, the janitor massively outperforming the Harvard-educated genius, is not just some wild thought experiment.
Yeah, it actually happens.
It happens in real life, and it happens, honestly, way more often than anyone inside the financial industry wants to admit.
It's the one field where that is actually possible.
Yeah, and welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we have an incredibly rich stack of sources in front of us, anchored by extensive excerpts from Morgan Housel's phenomenal book, The Psychology of Money.
Such an important book.
It really is. And our mission here, for you listening, is to break down the core ideas of this book, unpack the rigorous scientific studies and historical evidence behind them.
And ultimately, fundamentally shift how you view wealth, how you view risk, and, how you view your own happiness.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let me set the stage by telling you a tale of three men.
I love this framing, by the way, because it immediately highlights the central paradox of finance that we really need to wrestle with today.
So, man number one is a technology executive. Just an absolute genius in the traditional academic sense.
Like patented a key component in Wi-Fi routers kind of genius, right?
Exactly. In his 20s, he designs this tech, starts multiple companies, sells them, and becomes wildly, incomprehensibly successful.
But his relationship with money was a volatile mix of deep insecurity and, honestly, childish stupidity.
Oh, totally. He used to carry around a stack of $100 bills, several inches thick, just to show it off to people.
Just a physical brick of cash, carried as a prop.
Yeah, and the stories about him in the text are legendary. One day, he hands a colleague several $1,000s in cash, tells him to go to the local jewelry store and buy a handful of $1,000 gold coins.
And you know where this is going, and it just hurts.
It really does. So the colleague comes back, hands him the coins, and the tech executive and his buddies walk down to a dock overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
Please don't say.
And they proceed to literally skip these $1,000 solid gold coins into the sea like they were flat rocks.
It induces physical pain, just hearing the mechanics of that.
Right. Just cackling, arguing over whose gold coin skipped the furthest into the waves.
It's just wild.
And then, a few days later, he's at a high-end hotel restaurant, and he shatters a decorative lamp. The manager comes over, visibly frustrated, and politely explains it's a $500 lamp and he'll need to replace it.
Let me guess. He pulls out the brick.
He just scoffs, pulls out his brick of cash, peels off $5,000, shoves it at the manager, and says, "Now get out of my face and don't ever insult me like that again."
Yeah, we don't need a crystal ball to guess how that specific story ends.
No, we don't. Years later, that brilliant tech executive went completely broke. So that's man number one.
Okay. So who is man number two?
Man number two is Ronald Read. If you look up Ronald Read on Wikipedia, the entry begins, Ronald James Read was an American philanthropist, investor, janitor, and gas station attendant.
Wow. The absolute antithesis of the tech executive skipping gold into the Pacific.
Completely. He was born in rural Vermont. He hitchhiked to high school every day. He fixed cars at a gas station for 25 years, and then he swept floors at a JCPenney for 17 years.
So just a very ordinary working class life.
Exactly. He bought a 2-bedroom house for $12 grand, lived there his whole life, chopped his own firewood for fun, just the most low-key, average existence you could possibly imagine.
But Ronald Read died in 2014 at the age of 92. And that is when this rural janitor made international headlines.
Because when his estate was settled, he had a net worth of over $8 million.
And, that number requires context. In 2014, out of nearly 3 million Americans who passed away, fewer than 4,000 had a net worth over $8 million.
Wait, really? So he was in the absolute top percentile of wealth accumulation.
This floor sweeper was at the absolute top.
He left $2 million to his stepkids and more than $6 million to his local hospital and library. Everyone who knew him was utterly baffled.
They assumed he had won the lottery or had some secret inheritance.
But there was no secret. He just saved whatever tiny amount he could, invested it in blue chip stocks, which, for anyone unfamiliar, are just shares in giant established companies like Johnson & Johnson or Procter & Gamble.
Right, financially resilient companies. And then he just waited.
Decades of waiting until it compounded into a massive fortune. So that's man number two. Now contrast Ronald Read with man number three.
And this guy was actually making headlines just a few months before Ronald died, right?
Yeah, man number three is Richard Fuscone.
Here is where the hospital janitor versus the Harvard surgeon metaphor materializes in the real world.
Richard Fuscone was everything Ronald Read was not. He was Harvard educated, he had an MBA, he was a high-ranking executive at Merrill Lynch.
So the peak of financial pedigree.
Exactly. He was so incredibly successful in global finance that he retired in his 40s to become a philanthropist. The former CEO of Merrill Lynch publicly praised his business savvy, leadership skills, and sound judgment.
A major business magazine even put him on their 40 under 40 list.
But he had a catastrophic blind spot.
A blind spot that his education completely failed to illuminate.
In the mid-2000s, Fuscone borrowed heavily to expand an 18,000 square foot mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. We're talking 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 pools, 7 garages.
Unbelievable. Just the maintenance alone.
It cost over $90,000 a month just in basic maintenance. To finance this, he created a highly leveraged, illiquid empire.
And we should probably break those terms down for the listeners.
Yeah, so leveraged means he was using massive amounts of borrowed money to fund his lifestyle, which amplifies your gains, sure, but fundamentally magnifies your losses.
Right. And illiquid means his wealth was tied up in a mega mansion. You can't exactly sell half a swimming pool or 3 bathrooms overnight to raise cash when the bank comes calling.
Exactly. And then the 2008 financial crisis hit.
The crisis instantly evaporated the value of those assets, while the massive debt remained exactly the same.
He went bankrupt. He stood before a bankruptcy judge and stated on the record, "I currently have no income."
Wow.
First, his Palm Beach house was foreclosed. Then, 5 months before Ronald Read left his $8 million to charity, Fuscone's Greenwich mansion was sold in a foreclosure auction for 75% less than its estimated value.
So let's look at the totality of what you just laid out. You have the tech genius who goes broke, flexing cash and skipping gold into the ocean.
Yep.
You have the Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive who goes bankrupt, chasing a hopelessly leveraged mega mansion.
Yeah.
And you have the rural janitor who dies with $8 million.
This is the only industry on the planet where this happens.
It forces us to ask the most fundamental question about money. Why? Why can a janitor outinvest a Harvard MBA?
Because if it were simply a matter of processing power and intelligence, Fuscone wins in a landslide. If it were about academic pedigree, Fuscone wins.
Access to proprietary data, complex financial modeling software, Fuscone wins all of that.
So what is the hidden variable that allows the floor sweeper to win?
Well, the hidden variable is human behavior. The core premise of Housel's work and the foundational thesis we really need to internalize today is that financial success is not a hard science.
It's a soft skill.
Exactly. It is a soft skill. If you look at how finance is overwhelmingly taught in universities, it is treated like physics. You were taught formulas.
Mathematics of compound interest, historical correlation.
Right. The underlying assumption of the entire educational apparatus is that if you know the math, you simply plug the data into the formula dictates the rational action, and you go execute it like a machine.
But knowing what you are mathematically supposed to do tells you absolutely nothing about what actually happens in your nervous system when you try to execute that plan in the real world.
Precisely. Finance is driven by human psychology. It's driven by visceral emotions, by fear, greed, ego, and highly individualized nuance.
It's not about your intellectual capacity, it's about your behavioral regulation.
Yeah. A genius who loses control of their emotions, like our tech executive or our Merrill Lynch banker, can engineer an absolute financial disaster.
Conversely, an ordinary person with zero formal financial education can amass incredible wealth if they simply possess a handful of behavioral skills.
Which creates a natural bridge into understanding why behavior varies so wildly in the first place. I mean, if the math of compounding interest is the exact same for every person on Earth, why do we all approach money through completely irreconcilable lenses?
Right. And Housel frames this as the no one is crazy principle.
Yes.
I found this concept deeply challenging, honestly, because we witness people doing incredibly irrational things with money every single day.
Oh, absolutely. We all have that friend or family member whose financial decisions make us want to pull our hair out.
But the principle demands that we practice empathy instead of judgment. The idea is that no one is actually crazy. Every single financial decision a person makes complete sense to them in the exact moment they make it.
Because it's based on the unique mental model they constructed of how the world operates.
Right, and we have to ask how that mental model is constructed in the first place.
The answer is the sheer, unadulterated luck of the generational lottery. And there is fascinating empirical data to back this up.
Let's get into the data.
In 2006, two economists, Ulrich Mamandier and Stefan Nagel from the National Bureau of Economic Research, published a landmark study. They systematically dug through 50 years of data from the Survey of Consumer Finances.
Just for context for you listening, this is a massive, incredibly detailed data set tracking exactly what a broad cross-section of Americans do with their wealth over time.
Now, in classical economic theory, people should make investment decisions based on their current goals and the mathematical characteristics of the investment options available to them right now.
The rational actor model. You look at a spreadsheet of current yields and act accordingly.
But the economists found that the rational actor model is largely a myth. They discovered that people's lifetime investment decisions are heavily, almost entirely, anchored to the macroeconomic experiences they had early in their adult lives.
Completely independent of their baseline intelligence, their formal education, or their current income bracket.
It comes down to what the broader economy happened to be doing when your brain was in its late teens and 20s, highly impressionable and wiring its understanding of risk.
Let's look at the specific mechanics of that with the stock market, because the numbers here illuminate the concept perfectly. Say you were born in 1950.
Okay, 1950.
When you are in your teens and 20s, those critical years, when your brain is literally building the neural pathways that dictate your baseline understanding of how capitalism works, the stock market, adjusted for inflation, went literally nowhere.
It was completely stagnant.
So your lived experience, your deeply ingrained physical memory says the stock market is a flat, useless place to park your capital.
Right.
But shift the birth year by just 20 years. Say you were born in 1970. During your teens and 20s, the S&P 500, which is basically a thermometer for the American corporate economy, increased almost tenfold, adjusted for inflation.
That is an astronomical, life-changing return.
To that 1970 person, the stock market doesn't look flat. It looks like an infallible, gravity-defying wealth machine.
So you have these two groups of people. They could be equally intelligent, working at the exact same company, pulling in the exact same salary. But they are separated by the random chance of their birth here.
And they're going to navigate the rest of their lives with fundamentally, irreconcilably different views on risk and reward.
The person born in 1950 watches the 1970 person investing heavily in equities and thinks, you are recklessly throwing your money into a casino.
And the 1970 person looks at the 1950 person hoarding cash in a savings account and thinks, you are a terrified fool missing out on massive guaranteed growth.
And neither of them is crazy. They were just projecting a tiny sliver of their own lived experience onto the entirety of the global economy.
It's like two people arguing over the plot of a movie, but one person walked into the theater during the first hour, which was a slow romantic drama, and the other person walked in during the second hour, which was an explosive action sequence.
That's a perfect way to put it. They were both accurately describing what they saw, but they were both blind to the whole picture.
And this divergence applies to inflation, too. If you grew up in America in the 1960s, you hit your young adult years in the 1970s, you experienced triple inflation.
Oh, the gas lines.
You vividly remember waiting in endless gas lines. You remember getting a paycheck on a Friday, and by the next Friday, that exact same physical amount of money bought noticeably less food at the grocery store.
That leaves a psychological scar. That creates a lifelong, deeply rational paranoia about the declining purchasing power of fiat currency.
But if you were born in 1990, inflation has been functionally non-existent for almost your entire conscious life up until very recently. It wasn't even a concept you had to actively guard against.
You know, the sources recount a brilliant historical anecdote about John F. Kennedy running for president in 1960.
Oh, this is fascinating.
He was asked by a reporter what he personally remembered about the Great Depression, and Kennedy essentially admitted he had no firsthand knowledge of the suffering.
Because his family possessed one of the greatest fortunes in the world.
Exactly. He said they moved into bigger houses, hired more servants, and the only tangible manifestation of the Depression he saw directly was his father hiring extra gardeners just to artificially give local men jobs so their families could eat.
Kennedy didn't actually comprehend the devastating mechanics of the Depression until he read about it in a textbook at Harvard.
And the public was legitimately outraged by that admission. People asked how someone who didn't feel the emotional terror of the Depression could possibly be trusted to manage the national economy.
They were outraged because you cannot learn visceral fear from a textbook.
You can read a spreadsheet detailing a 30% macroeconomic contraction, but a spreadsheet cannot model the physiological terror of coming home, looking at your children, and genuinely wondering if the broader economic collapse has ruined their future.
Until you have lived through that specific environmental terror, you simply do not understand it deeply enough to alter your baseline behavior.
Which brings us to a really provocative thought experiment in the text regarding global working conditions. This aggressively highlights how vastly different these mental models can be across different cultures.
Yeah, the author brings up a story published in the New York Times regarding the Foxconn manufacturing plants in China.
All right, these are the massive, sprawling factories that assemble the smartphones and electronics we all rely on.
American journalists toured the facilities and described the working conditions as atrocious, essentially labeling them modern sweatshops. Long hours, grueling repetitive labor, tiny wages.
And the American readers were, predictably and rightfully based on their models, outraged.
But then a response appeared from the nephew of a Chinese worker at one of those very plants.
And his perspective operates in a universe completely alien to the Western reader.
He wrote that his aunt worked in those factories, and yes, it was punishing labor in harsh conditions. But then he posed a question to the outraged readers. Do you know what my aunt did to survive before she worked in this factory?
It's just a gut punch.
She was a prostitute. He stated that his aunt would infinitely rather be exploited by an evil capitalist factory boss for a couple of dollars a day than have her physical body exploited by multiple men for pennies just to avoid starvation.
He was actually furious at the American outrage. He felt they were applying a privileged, highly insulated Western framework to a survival situation they couldn't begin to comprehend.
To the American journalist, the factory is a blatant human rights violation. To the nephew, the factory is an incredible, life-saving step up the economic ladder.
I want to pause here because this is where the mechanics of decision-making get incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The point of examining the Foxconn story is not moral relativism. We are not saying that objectively harsh working conditions are ethically good.
Right.
The point is to dissect the mechanism of financial and economic decision-making. Every decision a person makes checks the specific boxes they need to check in that exact moment based on the limited information they have mapped onto their highly localized mental model of the world.
I hear that, but I want to push back on how far we extend this empathy. Are we saying there are no objectively bad financial decisions? Give me an example of a terrible financial decision that still somehow checks a box for the person making it.
Let's analyze the economics of lottery tickets. It is a massive, multi-billion-dollar industry. Americans spend more money annually on lottery tickets than they do on movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined.
That statistic is always jarring.
Now, we must look at the demographics of the purchasers. Statistically, lottery revenue is overwhelmingly driven by low-income individuals. The lowest-income households in the United States spend an average of $400 a year on lottery tickets.
At the exact same time, macroeconomic studies show that roughly 40% of Americans cannot come up with $400 in an emergency without borrowing it or selling something.
Exactly. So the very people blowing $400 a year on a mathematically abysmal bet with a 1 in a million payout are the exact same people who do not have a $400 cash safety net for when their car transmission inevitably breaks.
From an academic finance perspective, from the viewpoint of a rational actor optimizing capital, that is insane. It is objectively, mathematically the wrong thing to do.
If you view it exclusively through the lens of mathematics, yes. But remember the principle. No one is crazy. So we have to ask what psychological function the lottery ticket serves.
Okay, I'm listening.
If you have a comfortable median income, you likely have a safety net. You can afford a modest vacation. You have health insurance. You have a theoretical path to a comfortable retirement through a 401k.
Right, you have options.
You don't need the lottery because your current reality already contains the stability and the minor luxuries that the lottery promises. But if you are living in systemic, generational poverty, your reality lacks all of those things.
You don't have a plausible path to wealth.
You don't have a safety net. You cannot afford a vacation. So when that person spends $2 on a scratch-off ticket, they are not making a mathematical investment. They are purchasing a psychological product.
They are buying a dream.
Yes. They are buying the momentary physiological relief of imagining a life where their suffocating financial pressure is permanently lifted.
That reframes the entire transaction. You are buying a dream because your reality lacks a safety net. They are essentially paying $2 for a temporary hit of hope because the psychological payoff of that hope in that moment heavily outweighs the mathematical reality of the terrible odds.
You don't have to agree with the decision. Buying lotto tickets when you're broke is still a wealth-destroying habit that perpetuates poverty, but you have to understand the mechanism behind it.
Once you can observe someone doing something seemingly irrational and say, the math of what you're doing is terrible, but based on your lived experience and psychological needs, I see the logic of why you're doing it, you have unlocked the root of behavioral finance.
Understanding that behavioral root exposes an equally uncomfortable reality. If our entire worldview, our baseline risk tolerance, our fundamental expectations are entirely shaped by the macroeconomic lottery of the year we were born and the socioeconomic status of the family we're born into, well, then we're forced to ask a big question.
How much of our actual real-world financial success is just that, just sheer luck?
Exactly. And we violently reject that idea. The myth of the self-made genius is deeply embedded in our culture.
We want to believe that if we just optimize our routines, wake up at 4 a.m., take ice baths, and read the exact right books, we can entirely manufacture our own destiny.
But the text shatters this illusion using the story of Bill Gates. We all know the standard narrative. Bill Gates is supremely intelligent, intensely driven, attended a private school that happened to have a remarkably rare computer terminal in the late 1960s, founded Microsoft, and altered the trajectory of human technology.
The standard narrative is accurate, but it is incomplete. The text introduces a crucial counter-narrative by pairing Gates' story with a name almost entirely lost to history, Kent Evans.
Kent Evans was Bill Gates' best friend in high school. By every single historical account, Kent was just as brilliant as Bill, possessed the exact same relentless work ethic, and shared the identical obsession with early computing.
Gates himself is on record stating that Kent was the smartest guy in the room. They were scheming to conquer the emerging computing world together. But Kent Evans didn't co-found Microsoft, because before he even graduated high school, Kent Evans died in a tragic mountaineering accident.
This is the stark reality of life roulette. Bill Gates experienced a 1 in a million stroke of positive luck by attending the only high school in the country with advanced computer access, aligning perfectly with his natural aptitudes.
And Kent Evans experienced a 1 in a million stroke of tragic risk.
Both of their ultimate outcomes were dictated by forces entirely outside of their formidable intelligence or their work ethic. Luck and risk are siblings. They are two sides of the exact same coin, both representing the reality that every outcome in a complex system is influenced by variables outside of individual control.
The problem is that the forces of luck and risk are invisible and nearly impossible to quantify. So we default to ignoring them entirely. We look at highly successful individuals and automatically assume every single action they took was a stroke of calculated, repeatable genius.
There's a quote in the sources from Cornelius Vanderbilt, the legendary railroad tycoon.
Oh, this is a great one.
He was notoriously ruthless in his business practices, and he once brazenly declared, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" And because he won, because he amassed one of the largest fortunes in human history, biographers and business analysts look at that quote and frame it as evidence of his bold, visionary leadership.
But we must run the counterfactual. Imagine if the unpredictable winds of luck had blown just a millimeter in the other direction.
Imagine if an ambitious federal prosecutor had decided to make an example of Vanderbilt and successfully threw him in prison for blatant antitrust violations.
Suddenly, that exact same quote, "What do I care about the law?" undergoes a radical transformation in how we perceive it. It no longer looks bold or visionary. It looks foolishly reckless. It looks like the arrogant hubris of a criminal.
The behavior, the actual input, remains exactly the same. The only thing that changed was the outcome. But the outcome dictates entirely how we judge the character of the input.
The text uses Benjamin Graham to illustrate this as well. Benjamin Graham is universally revered as the father of value investing. He wrote The Intelligent Investor, which is essentially the Bible on portfolio diversification and risk management.
He was Warren Buffett's primary mentor.
Yet, if you look at the actual mathematics of Graham's personal wealth accumulation, the vast majority of his success came from aggressively breaking all of his own fundamental rules. He put an enormous, highly concentrated chunk of his portfolio into a single stock, Jaico.
Which fundamentally contradicts everything he spent his life teaching about the necessity of broad diversification.
And even Graham himself, in his later years, reflecting on that massive financial windfall from Jaico, posed the question, one lucky break or one supremely shrewd decision, can we tell them apart?
And he intellectually honestly admitted that no, you really can't cleanly separate the two.
This inability to separate skill from luck is why we must be incredibly cautious about what lessons we attempt to extract from highly successful people.
I refer to this as the Forbes magazine cover effect. We see a billionaire profile on the cover of Forbes, and we attempt to reverse engineer their life to isolate the secret recipe for extreme wealth.
We assume if I adopt their morning routine, if I mimic their aggressive management style, if I allocate capital into the same obscure sectors, I will inevitably replicate the result.
But we do not possess a magic wand that allows us to separate the repeatable, learnable skills from the invisible, unrepeatable luck that amplify those skills.
It's like playing a hand of poker. You can play the hand absolutely perfectly, you calculate the pot odds, you read the opponent, you make the mathematically optimal bet, but you still lose the hand because the opponent catches a lucky card on the river.
The execution was flawless, but the outcome was a failure due to risk. And the reverse is true. You can play a hand terribly, make every statistical mistake, and still win the pot because you got lucky.
Which highlights a critical corollary. Just as we over-attribute success to innate skill, we heavily over-attribute failure to sheer incompetence. We are constantly told that failure is the greatest teacher.
But failure can actually be a terrible, highly misleading teacher if you don't understand the mechanics of probability.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How can learning from failure be a bad thing?
Suppose you make a highly calculated financial decision. You conduct exhaustive research, you acquire a fundamentally sound asset, and the probabilistic odds are 80% in your favor that you will generate a substantial profit.
Okay, sounds good so far.
But an 80% probability of success inherently carries a 20% probability of failure. If you execute the strategy perfectly, but you happen to trigger that 20% tail risk, perhaps an unpredictable global pandemic halts supply chains, or a localized natural disaster destroys the physical asset, you will lose your capital.
But the immediate human instinct is to look at the financial loss and internalize it as a personal failure. We say, I lost money, therefore I made a terrible decision, I am an incompetent investor, and I must completely overhaul my entire strategy.
That is the trap. You didn't make a bad decision. You made a highly rational decision that experienced an unfavorable outcome due to the inescapable presence of risk.
If you overhaul a fundamentally sound strategy simply because you encountered a predictable statistical variance, you are learning the exact wrong lesson from your failure.
This is why evaluating financial outcomes, both your own and those of others, requires a profound level of humility. Outcomes are rarely as purely good or purely bad as they appear on the surface.
If we accept that premise, that we cannot cleanly replicate the extreme success of billionaires because so much of it is tangled up in unrepeatable luck, what should our actual objective be?
How do we construct a financial life that avoids the catastrophic hubris of Richard Fuscone, the Harvard MBA, who kept pushing his leverage until he lost everything?
That dilemma perfectly sets up the psychology of enough and the invisible nature of wealth. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Defining the concept of enough is arguably the single most powerful defensive mechanism you can engineer in your financial architecture.
There is a story in the sources that illustrates this beautifully. It takes place at a lavish party hosted by a billionaire hedge fund manager on Shelter Island in New York. Kurt Vonnegut, the celebrated author, is attending the party with his friend Joseph Heller, who wrote the classic novel Catch-22.
Great authors.
Vonnegut turns to Heller and points out that the billionaire hosting the party had likely made more money in a single day of trading than Heller had earned from the global success of Catch-22 over its entire publishing history.
And Heller just looks at Vonnegut and responds, yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough.
It is a stunning, paradigm-shifting realization. In the realm of finance, the most difficult skill to master is getting the goalpost to stop moving.
The moving goalpost is the ultimate psychological trap of social comparison. The text provides a highly relatable analogy to explain the mechanics of this trap.
Imagine a rookie baseball player who gets called up to the major leagues and signs a contract for $500,000 a year.
By any rational statistical definition of global income, that rookie is incredibly rich. He is in the top fraction of a percent of earners.
He feels on top of the world. But then he walks into the clubhouse, and his locker happens to be situated next to Mike Trout.
And Mike Trout is operating in a different stratosphere. He is playing on a 12-year, $430 million contract, earning roughly $36 million a year.
So our rookie, who is making $500,000, looks at Mike Trout, engages in the natural human instinct of social comparison, and suddenly his $500,000 feels entirely inadequate.
He feels broke relative to his immediate peer. But the chain of comparison doesn't end there. Think about Mike Trout. $36 million a year is a staggering, unfathomable amount of capital. But who does Mike Trout socialize with?
He socializes with the people who own the teams. He socializes with hedge fund managers.
To simply make the list of the top 10 highest paid hedge fund managers in 2018, an individual needed to earn a minimum of $340 million in a single year.
The mechanism of comparison is relentless. Mike Trout, earning an elite $36 million, might look at the hedge fund manager earning $340 million, and suddenly Mike Trout feels like he is underperforming.
It is a ladder with no top rung. If your internal definition of wealth is defined externally as having more accumulated capital than the people around me, you are playing a game that mathematically cannot be won.
The text quotes a veteran Las Vegas casino dealer who states that the only guaranteed way to win in a casino is to exit the building the moment you enter.
If you sit down at the table of social comparison, the house will always eventually win. You will continuously gamble away your current happiness and stability in a futile attempt to catch the next person on the ladder.
The reason we fall so easily into the trap of social comparison is rooted in our evolutionary biology. We are highly visual creatures, and we judge status based on visual cues.
This creates what the author calls the man in the car paradox.
I am incredibly guilty of falling for this paradox. Break down how it works.
Picture yourself sitting at a red light in traffic. A brand new, heavily customized $300,000 Ferrari pulls up into the lane next to you. The individual driving that Ferrari almost certainly purchased it because they want to broadcast a specific signal to the world.
They want to signal that they are highly successful.
They are seeking respect. They are seeking admiration. They want pedestrians and other drivers to look at them and think, wow, that individual has truly mastered the game of life.
But what is the actual psychological reaction of the bystander? When I see that car, I stare at the sleek design, the engine, the leather interior, and I instantly imagine myself driving it.
I imagine the respect I would get if I owned it.
I don't give a single fleeting thought to the actual human being sitting behind the steering wheel.
The paradox is that people acquire expensive, highly visible objects to solicit respect and admiration from others. But those bystanders do not inherently respect the owner. They simply utilize the object as a visual prop to project their own desires for wealth and status.
The driver believes he is purchasing admiration, but in reality, he is merely purchasing a mirror that reflects other people's aspirations.
Which introduces the ultimate defining irony of this entire conceptual block. True wealth is what you don't see.
This requires a profound redefinition of terms. In modern consumer society, we heavily conflate the concept of being rich with the concept of being wealthy.
Rich simply implies current income. You drive a Ferrari, you live in a sprawling estate, you wear expensive watches. We visually judge that as success because the expenditure is highly visible.
But true wealth is hidden. Wealth is the luxury car that was not purchased. It's the diamond necklace that was not bought. It's the first-class flight upgrade that was politely declined.
Wealth consists of financial assets, stocks, bonds, cash reserves, that have not yet been converted into visible consumer goods.
This instantly brings to mind the Rihanna story detailed in the sources. It perfectly encapsulates the confusion between rich and wealthy.
It is a phenomenal case study in financial cognitive dissonance.
The pop star Rihanna was generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue, but she was burning through that capital so aggressively on visible lifestyle expenditures that she nearly forced herself into bankruptcy.
In response, she actually sued her financial advisor, legally blaming him for the catastrophic loss of her money.
The advisor's formal response in court was absolutely brutal but mathematically unassailable. He essentially stated, was it really necessary to explain to her that if you spend money on physical things, you will end up with the physical things and not the money?
It sounds like a punchline, but it reveals a massive, widespread cognitive blind spot. When the average person declares, I want to be a millionaire, what they're fundamentally saying is, I want to spend $1 million.
And the act of spending $1 million is literally the mechanical opposite of being a millionaire.
If you spend the capital, you no longer possess the capital. It is arithmetic at its most basic level, yet we completely fail to grasp it because our brains are wired to learn through visual imitation.
Since true wealth is entirely hidden, like Ronald Read's secret brokerage accounts that no one knew existed for decades, it is incredibly difficult to imitate.
We clearly see Fuscone's mega mansion, so society attempts to imitate Fuscone. We cannot see Reed's index funds compounding silently in the dark, so society ignores him.
And this hidden nature of wealth is deeply intertwined with the actual mathematical forces that build it. If wealth isn't generated by spending and it accumulates in the shadows, we must analyze the unseen mechanical force that drives it.
What was the actual engine behind Ronald Read's secret fortune?
The engine is compounding, which introduces a mathematical reality that our linear brains violently reject. To prove just how poorly equipped our cognitive architecture is to understand exponential growth, let's run a simple mathematical thought experiment.
Okay, I'm ready.
If I ask you to calculate 8 plus 8 9 times in a row, so 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8, your brain can process that relatively easily. You intuitively know it's 72.
That is linear thinking. It scales predictably.
But what if I ask you to take 8 times 8 9 times in a row, so 8 by 8 by 8 by 8? What does your intuition tell you that number is?
Your intuition completely collapses. A linear trained brain might guess it's a few thousand, maybe tens of thousands if they realize it's multiplying. But the actual mathematical answer is over 134 million.
Over 134 million. Our brains are simply not evolved to comprehend exponential growth. We are linear creatures navigating an exponentially scaling universe.
And the most glaring, real-world example of our collective blindness to the mechanics of compounding is Warren Buffett. The financial media is utterly obsessed with uncovering Buffett's secret.
There are thousands of books written attempting to deconstruct his investment methodology. How does he construct a discounted cash flow model? How does he evaluate the long-term competitive moat of a business?
But all of those granular analyses miss the most glaringly obvious, mathematically dominant variable. Warren Buffett's net worth at the time the author was writing this book was roughly $84.5 billion. Do you know how much of that $84.5 billion was accumulated after he reached his 65th birthday?
The statistic is almost unbelievable. It's $81.5 billion.
Out of $84.5 billion, $81.5 billion was generated after traditional retirement age. His fundamental secret is not merely that he possesses a high-functioning intellect for evaluating businesses.
His primary secret is that he began compounding capital when he was 10 years old, and he relentlessly sustained that compounding for 3/4 of a century.
If Buffett had lived a standard financial life cycle, if he had learned everything he knew, started investing at age 30 with, say, $25,000, and then retired at age 60 to play golf, even if he maintained his exact same phenomenal annualized rate of return, his net worth wouldn't be $84 billion.
The math dictates it would be roughly $11 million.
The difference between $84 billion and $11 million is not skill. It is simply the compression of the timeline. It proves unequivocally that the time in the market is exponentially more powerful than the timing of the market.
The text utilizes a brilliant historical analogy regarding the Ice Ages to explain the underlying mechanics of this compounding feedback loop. For generations, scientists struggled to understand what catastrophic mechanism could cause massive, miles-thick sheets of ice to cover vast portions of the Earth.
They assumed it required an event of tremendous violent force, massive meteor strikes, apocalyptic volcanic eruptions, or violent shifts in the Earth's orbital axis.
They were searching for a massive input to explain a massive output.
But a Russian meteorologist named Vladimir Kupin eventually deciphered the mechanism, and it involved no cataclysm whatsoever. He discovered that an ice age is not triggered by a brutally uncharacteristically cold winter. It's triggered by a marginally slightly cooler summer.
The mechanics are fascinating. If the summer is just a tiny fraction of a degree cooler than average, a small portion of the winter snow fails to melt.
So the following winter, the baseline starts with a pre-existing layer of snow. That snow reflects solar radiation back into the atmosphere, which marginally cools the Earth a tiny bit more.
This means even less snow melts the following summer. It creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop. A slightly cool summer compounds relentlessly over thousands of years until half the globe is crushed beneath the weight of glaciers.
The profound lesson here is that you do not require tremendous, forceful inputs to engineer tremendous outputs. You merely require a modest starting base and relentless, uninterrupted compounding.
The critical vulnerability is that because exponential compounding is so counterintuitive to our linear brains, we constantly impulsively try to interrupt it.
We attempt to outsmart the system by constantly trading in and out of the market, chasing the highest short-term yields, when the mathematically supreme strategy is simply to acquire sound assets and refuse to interrupt the compounding process.
Which introduces the second mathematical concept that our brains consistently fail to grasp: the power of tail events.
Tail events represent the furthest, most extreme ends of a statistical distribution of outcomes. If you analyze the mechanics of capitalism, it is fundamentally not driven by average median results. The entirety of the system is driven by a tiny fraction of extreme outliers.
The book introduces the fascinating case study of Heinz Berggruen to illustrate this. He was an art dealer who managed to amass one of the most historically significant and financially valuable collections of 20th century art in the world.
The art community viewed him as a savant, assuming he possessed a golden eye that could simply spot a masterpiece hidden in a pile of junk from a mile away.
But what was the actual mechanical secret to his success?
His secret was sheer, unadulterated volume. He acquired massive, almost unimaginable quantities of art. The mathematical reality is that 99% of the pieces he purchased were likely mediocre or entirely worthless.
But the failure rate was completely irrelevant, because the 1% of the art he acquired happened to be early foundational works by Pablo Picasso.
What's fascinating here is that the massive, exponential compounding value of that 1% tail outcome more than compensated for all the capital lost on the 99% of failures. He can be fundamentally wrong almost all the time and still end up stupendously, historically right.
That concept is so liberating, but so completely counterintuitive. You can be wrong half the time and still generate a massive fortune.
We look at master investors or visionary CEOs, and we fall into the trap of assuming every single strategic move they make is an act of calculated genius.
But George Soros summarized the reality perfectly. It's not whether you're right or wrong that's important, but how much money you make when you're right and how much you lose when you're wrong.
The statistics bear this out across industries. If you are an elite stock picker, you might only be right 50% of the time. If you launch a startup, maybe 1 out of 10 product lines gains traction.
The text points out that Walt Disney produced over 400 cartoons that either lost money or barely broke even, nearly bankrupting the studio multiple times. The entire financial trajectory of the Disney empire was salvaged and subsequently built upon a single massive tail event.
The unprecedented success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The macroeconomy is entirely driven by tails.
If the mathematical secret to wealth is allowing compounding to run uninterrupted, and if the vast majority of gains are generated by a tiny handful of unpredictable tail events, then the only variable that truly matters is your ability to survive long enough to experience those tails.
You simply have to stay at the table. But as we explore the concept of survival, we realize that surviving a volatile system isn't about being perfectly coldly rational like an algorithmic trading bot. It's about being fundamentally reasonable.
This distinction between rational and reasonable is arguably the most practical, actionable insight in the entire text. Maximizing rationality often leads to catastrophic failure in systems driven by human emotion.
To explain the danger of being coldly rational, the book details the deeply unsettling medical history of Julius Wagner Jauregg. He was a prominent 19th century psychiatrist who discovered a treatment for syphilis, which was at the time a devastating fatal disease.
What was his groundbreaking, scientifically rational medical technique? He deliberately infected his syphilis patients with malaria.
Which, to a modern listener, sounds like horrific, barbaric malpractice.
It sounds insane. He literally injected patients with a highly lethal pathogen. But if you examine his logic purely through a scientific, rational lens, it made sense. He hypothesized that the extreme, prolonged fever generated by the malaria infection would essentially cook the syphilis bacteria and destroy it.
He could then subsequently treat the newly introduced malaria with quinine. Technically, his scientific logic was sound, the mechanism worked, he actually won a Nobel Prize for the discovery.
But was it reasonable to inject suffering patients with a lethal disease?
Absolutely not.
The risk of the cure killing the patient before the syphilis did was astronomically high. It was perfectly rational, but wildly unreasonable.
Which brings me to a crucial question for you. When we look at personal finance, shouldn't we strive to be Julius Wagner Jauregg? Shouldn't we rely on advanced academic finance and complex spreadsheet modeling to be perfectly coldly rational with every dollar we earn?
Why wouldn't we want to ruthlessly optimize our capital for the absolute maximum mathematical return?
Because you are fundamentally not a spreadsheet. You are a biological organism. You are a human being burdened with fluctuating emotions, a spouse, children, an ego, deep-seated fears, and a vulnerable nervous system.
The mathematically optimal investment strategy is completely utterly useless if the psychological pain of executing it causes you to abandon the strategy the moment the market drops 20% in a panic.
Let's examine another Nobel laureate to prove this point, Harry Markowitz. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for inventing modern portfolio theory.
Let's briefly define modern portfolio theory for the listeners, just so we understand the magnitude of his intellect.
Modern portfolio theory is essentially the complex mathematical framework for optimizing a portfolio. It uses advanced variance formulas to determine the exact mix of assets, how many stocks versus how many bonds, that will generate the highest possible expected return for a specific, defined level of risk.
It is the absolute pinnacle, the godfather concept of rational, mathematically optimized investing.
So how did the godfather of rational investing, the man who invented the math, allocate his own personal retirement capital in the 1950s?
He completely ignored his own Nobel Prize-winning research. He didn't use the complex variance formulas. He simply split his money 50-50 down the middle between equities and bonds.
When he was interviewed and asked to explain the highly advanced rationale behind this rudimentary allocation, he didn't cite an algorithm.
He stated that he visualized the psychological grief he would experience if the stock market skyrocketed and he wasn't fully participating, and he weighed that against the profound grief he would feel if the market crashed and he lost half his net worth.
His objective wasn't to mathematically maximize his financial return. His objective was to minimize his future regret.
The man who literally wrote the mathematical laws of optimization abandoned the math so he could sleep soundly at night. He actively chose to be less rational so he could be more reasonable.
And this realization leads to a piece of advice from the author that completely contradicts traditional financial dogma. The author argues that you should actually strive to love your investments.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. Every financial guru, every textbook tells you to ruthlessly eliminate emotion from the process. Don't fall in love with a stock, keep a cold head.
On a spreadsheet, emotionless investing is the rational ideal. But in the messy reality of the real world, a lack of emotional attachment is a massive liability. Let's look at the mechanics of market returns.
On any given day, the historical odds of the stock market going up are roughly 50-50. It's essentially a coin flip.
But if you extend the time horizon to a 20-year period, the historical odds of making a positive return approach 100%. The mathematical key to capturing that long-term gain is sheer endurance.
You have to physically and psychologically survive the brutal, inevitable bear markets.
If you are coldly, clinically rational, and hold absolutely zero emotional attachment to your chosen strategy, the minute that strategy underperforms the broader market, your purely rational brain will calculate that it is failing, and you will abandon it. you will likely sell at the absolute bottom of the crash.
But if you are a reasonable investor who actually holds an emotional affinity for your imperfect strategy, perhaps it heavily aligns with your personal ethical values, or perhaps you just deeply understand the underlying businesses, you possess a psychological anchor.
That emotional anchor provides the necessary endurance to stick with the strategy during the lean years, keeping you in the game long enough for compounding to resume its work.
That completely flips the paradigm. Emotion isn't the enemy. When properly directed, emotion is the anchor that prevents you from abandoning the ship during a storm.
And discussing how to weather a storm brings us to another critical mechanical concept, the margin of safety. The text uses a fantastic, highly illustrative analogy involving professional blackjack card counters.
Like the guys from the infamous MIT blackjack team, right? Kevin Lewis.
Exactly. These individuals are playing a game governed entirely by strict mathematical probabilities.
And we should clarify how card counting actually works. Card counting does not grant the player psychic abilities to predict the exact next card that will be dealt.
It is simply a system of tracking the ratio of high cards to low cards remaining in the shoe. When the remaining deck is statistically concentrated with high cards, tens, and aces, the mathematical odds shift marginally in the player's favor.
Increasing the probability of hitting a blackjack or the dealer busting.
But here is the critical limitation. Even when the math dictates that the odds have shifted completely in your favor, the professional card counter can never, ever bet their entire stack of chips on a single hand.
Because even if the count is sky high and you possess a 95% statistical probability of winning the hand, there inherently remains a 5% probability that you will lose.
If you bet your entire bankroll and happen to hit that 5% tail risk, you are financially ruined. You are physically ejected from the game. You cannot play the subsequent hand, even if the odds remain highly favorable.
You must intentionally leave a margin of safety, a buffer of unbet capital, so you can survive the inevitable statistical variance and continue playing.
The margin of safety is the only viable mechanism for navigating a universe governed by probabilities rather than certainties. But human psychology is notoriously terrible at incorporating a margin for error.
There is a fascinating study conducted at Harvard by Max Bezerman regarding the psychology of home renovations.
You discover that when individuals evaluate other people's proposed renovation plans, they are highly rational. They accurately predict, based on historical data, that the project will likely go 25% to 50% over budget and significantly past the deadline.
But when those exact same individuals evaluate their own identical renovation projects, they completely abandon the historical data. They universally assume their specific project will execute flawlessly, on time, and strictly within the initial budget.
We suffer from a chronic planning fallacy. We desperately avoid building a margin of safety into our own lives because doing so requires a painful admission of ignorance.
It requires looking in the mirror and saying, I cannot predict the future and things will likely go wrong.
And that illusion, the deep-seated belief that we can accurately forecast the future based on the past, is precisely what destroys capital. We inherently believe we can study history and utilize it as a literal roadmap for what will happen next.
Which introduces a monumental flaw in how we plan, captured perfectly by a quote from Stanford professor Scott Sagan. Things that have never happened before happen all the time.
That sentence should be permanently etched onto the monitors of every economic forecaster on Wall Street. Things that have never happened before happen all the time.
We tend to treat economic historians as if they are modern-day prophets. We analyze past market crashes to predict the next one. But economic history is not a predictive map. It is merely a study of continual evolution.
Because economics is not governed by the immutable laws of physics. The foundational laws of thermodynamics or gravity have not altered over the last billion years. If you drop an apple today, it falls at the exact same rate it did during the Roman Empire.
But the laws of economics constantly mutate, because economics is entirely driven by human emotions, cultural shifts, and technological innovation.
The text uses Benjamin Graham again to illustrate this evolutionary reality. Graham's seminal book, The Intelligent Investor, provides highly specific, mathematically rigorous formulas for identifying undervalued stocks.
But if a modern investor attempts to utilize the exact formulas printed in the original 1949 edition today, they will massively underperform the market. Why? Because Graham himself had to continuously rewrite the formulas in subsequent editions.
The mechanism is simple. Once a highly effective formula became widely publicized and popular, millions of investors began utilizing it. The market adapted to the new behavior. The inefficiency was arbitraged away, and the formula completely lost its competitive edge.
The market is a living, breathing, adapting organism.
I have to pause and challenge this because it creates a massive existential problem for the listener. If historical data is fundamentally useless for specific forecasting, and if the market constantly adapts to render old strategies obsolete, how on earth are we supposed to practically plan for the future?
How can I possibly plan for a retirement that is 30 years away if I can't look at historical returns to predict what capital I will require?
That is the essential dilemma, and resolving it requires us to confront one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena detailed in the book, the end of history illusion.
This concept was pioneered by Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, and it explains why our long-term planning is so frequently disastrous.
The mechanics of this illusion completely shifted my perspective.
Explain how it works.
The end of history illusion is the measurable psychological phenomenon where human beings are acutely aware of how much their personalities, desires, and values have drastically changed in the past, yet they simultaneously falsely believe that their current self is the final finished product, and they will not fundamentally change in the future.
It's so true. You look back at who you were a decade ago and you cringe. You think, wow, I was incredibly naive. I listened to terrible music. I prioritized the wrong relationships. My career goals were completely misguided.
But now I have finally matured. I have figured out the optimal way to live, and my current values are permanent.
Daniel Gilbert summarized the absurdity of this illusion perfectly. Young people pay good money to get tattoos removed that teenagers paid good money to get. Middle-aged people rush to divorce people who young adults rush to marry.
We are in a state of continuous, lifelong psychological evolution. Yet we rigidly architect our long-term financial plans under the delusion that our current desires will remain static forever.
It's like packing a single suitcase for a year-long trip across the globe. But you pack nothing but heavy winter coats because it happens to be snowing on the day you leave your house. You completely fail to anticipate that the climate will inevitably change.
So how does this illusion practically infect our financial planning?
It manifests in the adoption of extreme, highly rigid financial plans. For instance, you see young professionals who commit to extreme austerity, eating nothing but rice and beans, living in a converted van, refusing to socialize all to achieve a hyper-aggressive goal of retiring by age 30.
Conversely, you see individuals who commit to working 80 hours a week in a high-stress, toxic corporate environment, sacrificing their health and relationships to fund a lifestyle of extreme luxury and status.
The fatal vulnerability of both of these extreme approaches is the end of history illusion.
The individual living in the van might wake up at age 35, realize their values have shifted, decide they deeply desire a family and a stable community, and suffer profound regret that they sacrificed a decade of career progression that could have supported those new goals.
And the corporate grinder might wake up at age 45, physically and emotionally burned out, realize they squandered their entire youth chasing a slightly larger BMW, and feel a crushing sense of emptiness.
Precisely. Extreme financial plans almost inevitably guarantee extreme future regrets because your underlying goals will evolve.
Therefore, the only truly rational long-term strategy is one that actively builds in extreme flexibility. You should aggressively save money, but you do not necessarily need a highly specific, rigid goal for those savings.
You should maintain a moderate, sustainable lifestyle that avoids the extremes of both austerity and gluttony. You have to internalize the reality that you are currently saving capital for a future version of yourself that you have not even met yet, and you have absolutely no idea what that stranger will value or desire.
That is a staggering way to view it. We are literally saving money to give a stranger options. But navigating this unpredictable future while carrying the weight of a stranger's unknown goals is not a frictionless process.
It demands that we pay a toll. And that introduces the critical concept of hidden fees and the seductive nature of pessimism. Everything in a capitalist system has a price attached to it.
Yes. Housel frames this through the highly effective lens of fee versus fine. We intuitively grasp this concept when dealing with tangible, physical objects.
If you desire a brand new $30,000 automobile, you fundamentally understand you must pay the price. You have three options. You can write a check for $30,000, you can compromise and buy a cheaper used car, or theoretically, you could attempt to steal the car.
We universally understand that stealing the car is a catastrophic idea because the legal and social consequences massively outweigh the benefit of the vehicle.
But when investors enter the financial markets, they constantly attempt to steal the car.
They do, because the price tag in the financial markets is invisible. The price of achieving phenomenal compounding investment returns over a multi-decade period is not measured in dollars and cents.
The price is paid in the psychological currency of volatility, paralyzing fear, and the agonizing uncertainty of watching your life savings temporarily plummet by 20% or 30% during a macroeconomic recession.
That emotional suffering is the required admission fee for the greatest wealth-building apparatus ever created. But investors deeply resent paying it. They want the 10% annualized returns without enduring the volatility.
So they attempt to time the market. They aggressively trade in and out of asset classes. They are fundamentally trying to steal the returns without paying the emotional toll.
And attempting to evade that fee almost always ends in disaster. The text provides a fascinating high-level corporate case study of this phenomenon involving Jack Welch, the legendary former CEO of General Electric.
During Welch's tenure, GE was universally celebrated by Wall Street for producing incredibly consistent, smooth quarterly earnings. Quarter after quarter, year after year, the profits seemed to march upward in a perfectly predictable straight line, completely divorced from the messy volatility of the broader economy.
But that predictability was a carefully engineered illusion. Welch and his executive team were utilizing highly complex, borderline deceptive accounting maneuvers to artificially smooth out the earnings.
The mechanics were simple. If GE had an exceptionally profitable quarter, the executives would essentially hide a portion of those profits in obscure accounting reserves.
Later, when the company inevitably experienced a poor quarter, they would quietly release those hidden reserves to artificially boost the reported numbers. They were deliberately shielding their shareholders from the natural, unavoidable volatility of a capitalist enterprise.
They were systematically trying to avoid paying the fee.
Exactly. But the fundamental laws of economics always eventually collect their due. Because the company and the shareholders refused to pay the required price of minor volatility in the short term, the massive accumulated bill came due later.
The accounting manipulations eventually unraveled under scrutiny. The underlying structural weaknesses of the conglomerate were exposed, and GE shareholders suffered through an agonizing decade of mammoth, wealth-destroying losses.
The penny gains manufactured during the Welch era translated into dime losses a decade later. You cannot evade the fee.
This requires a massive psychological reframing of how we interpret a market crash. When the stock market drops 15%, our instinct is to view it as a fine, a punishment levied against us because we made a mistake or did something wrong.
But we need to actively reframe that drop as a fee, the standard cost of admission to participate in long-term compounding. If you receive a parking fine, you alter your behavior to avoid it in the future.
But if you pay a $150 entrance fee to get into Disneyland, you don't view it as a punishment, you accept it as the necessary cost to experience the ride.
That analogy perfectly captures the required mindset. However, maintaining that mindset and willfully accepting that fee is incredibly difficult because of how easily human psychology gets swept up in market bubbles and the overwhelming seduction of pessimism.
Let's analyze the actual mechanics of why financial bubbles form. The standard narrative is that bubbles are purely the result of mass, irrational greed. But the book proposes a much more nuanced structural theory.
Bubbles fundamentally materialize when long-term investors innocently begin taking behavioral cues from short-term traders.
This was a massive light bulb moment for me. The realization that participants in the market are not all playing the same game.
Correct. Consider a simple question. Is Google stock currently trading at a good price? There is no single objective answer to that question.
If you are a 60-year-old widow investing capital to fund a 30-year retirement, you evaluate the company based on decades of projected discounted cash flows.
Just to briefly define that, discounted cash flow is a valuation method that estimates the total value of an investment today based on projections of how much actual cash it will generate over its entire future lifespan.
But if you are a 25-year-old day trader operating on high margin, looking to capture momentum over the next 3 hours before the market closes, you do not care about a 30-year discounted cash flow model. You only care about immediate charting patterns and short-term volume.
The day trader might aggressively purchase a stock that is wildly, objectively overvalued based on fundamentals simply because he sees momentum and knows he's going to sell it to someone else before lunch. For his specific game, the purpose is entirely rational.
The catastrophic bubble forms when the 30-year widow observes the day trader generating massive short-term profits, falsely assumes they are playing the exact same game with the exact same rules, and begins copying his trades.
She buys the wildly overvalued asset, mistakenly believing it is a sound, long-term fundamental investment. They are operating on the exact same financial playing field, but they are playing completely different games.
And when those games inevitably collide and the momentum breaks, The long-term investor is the one who gets crushed.
So when a charismatic analyst on CNBC aggressively tells the camera to buy this stock immediately, that advice is inherently flawed because he has absolutely no idea who you are, what your time horizon is, or what specific game you are playing.
Taking generalized financial advice is tantamount to financial suicide. We have to clearly define our own specific game, write down the rules, and put massive blinders on to ignore everyone else playing a different game.
But even if you manage to establish those blinders, it is nearly impossible not to get sucked into the vortex of macroeconomic pessimism. Why are we so deeply infatuated with bad news?
Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning behavioral psychologist, explains our infatuation with pessimism through the lens of evolutionary biology.
In the brutal environment of early human evolution, organisms that treated potential threats as vastly more urgent than potential opportunities had a significantly higher probability of surviving long enough to reproduce.
If you ignore a rustling in the bushes because you assume it's just the wind and it turns out to be a tiger, you are removed from the gene pool. If you miss an opportunity to eat a piece of fruit because you were too cautious, you might experience temporary hunger, but you survive.
We are biologically, neurologically hardwired to prioritize and panic over bad news.
And that hardwiring heavily dictates how we consume financial information. Optimism almost always sounds like a sleazy, self-serving sales pitch. But pessimism sounds intellectually rigorous. It sounds like someone is genuinely trying to save your life.
If an economist publishes a deeply researched paper stating the stock market will likely return a historically average 8% a year for the next decade, you yawn and scroll past it. It's boring.
But if a pundit goes on television and forcefully predicts a catastrophic, unprecedented depression arriving next Tuesday that will completely wipe out your retirement savings, you immediately tune in. Your heart rate spikes, you share the article with your family, and you prepare to liquidate your portfolio.
And because the stakes of global finance are so incredibly high, because a total market collapse could legitimately ruin our carefully constructed lives, we desperately attempt to fill the terrifying blind spots of uncertainty with cohesive narratives. We want the world to make logical sense.
This psychological vulnerability is precisely how Bernie Madoff managed to perpetuate the largest Ponzi scheme in history for so long. He promised highly sophisticated investors a narrative of steady, consistent, impossible returns that defied the mathematical realities of the market.
And these highly educated investors willingly handed him billions of dollars. Why? Because Madoff told a highly compelling story, and the investors wanted that story to be true so desperately that they collectively willfully ignored the glaring mathematical red flags. We instinctively use narratives to impose artificial order on a fundamentally chaotic and uncertain world.
Which brings us to the culmination of this deep dive. We have covered a truly massive amount of intellectual ground today.
We have dissected the random mechanics of the generational lottery, deconstructed the dangerous illusion of the self-made genius, explored the treacherous moving goalposts of social comparison, analyzed the mind-bending math of long-term compounding, debated the absolute necessity of maintaining a margin for error, and exposed the hidden emotional fees of investing.
So, synthesizing all of this profound behavioral analysis from Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money, what is the ultimate actionable takeaway?
If wealth isn't about buying a Ferrari to impress strangers at a stoplight, what is the actual fundamental purpose of accumulating capital?
The author anchors the conclusion of the book to the extensive research of Angus Campbell, a prominent psychologist who dedicated his career to studying what specific variables actually generate measurable human happiness.
After analyzing vast data sets, Campbell found that the highest correlation with positive well-being was not the square footage of an individual's home, the prestige of their corporate title, or the sheer size of their bank account.
The most dependable, statistically significant predictor of positive human well-being is possessing a strong, undeniable sense of controlling one's own life and schedule.
The highest, most valuable dividend that money can possibly pay is the ability to wake up every single morning, look in the mirror, and say, I have the autonomy to do whatever I want today, with whoever I want, for as long as I want.
Controlling your time. Autonomy is the ultimate manifestation of true wealth. It's not the physical objects, it's the unencumbered freedom.
And to achieve that autonomy, you do not necessarily need to optimize a complex spreadsheet. In fact, Housel shares a highly personal, vulnerable confession in the concluding chapters of the book that perfectly proves this thesis.
He details the decision process he and his wife went through when they decided to fully pay off the mortgage on their family home, despite the fact that they held an incredibly low highly favorable interest rate.
Which, if evaluated strictly through the lens of academic finance and mathematical optimization, is a terrible, inefficient allocation of capital.
Exactly. Any rational, mathematically driven financial advisor would look at that decision and say, you are making a massive mistake. You should retain the cheap mortgage debt at 3%, take that lump sum of cash, and invest it in a diversified index fund where you will historically earn a 7% or 8% return.
You are mathematically losing money by paying off the house. On a strictly constructed spreadsheet, eliminating that low-interest debt was the worst financial decision Housel ever made.
But psychologically, behaviorally, it was the absolute best decision he could possibly engineer. Because his primary objective was not to ruthlessly maximize his annualized yield, his objective was to maximize his family's independence and emotional security.
The psychological utility of completely removing a massive looming monthly obligation, the profound peace of mind of owning their shelter outright, allowed them to sleep perfectly soundly at night.
That emotional stability has an incalculable value. It was an entirely reasonable decision for their specific mental model, even if it completely failed the test of pure rationality.
The ultimate lesson of the text is that there is no single, universally correct mathematical answer in personal finance. There is only the highly individualized process of discovering what behavioral framework works for you to maximize your control over your own time.
Just what works for you to gain control over your time. That beautifully brings everything full circle, tying the mechanics of finance directly back to the reality of human psychology.
But before we officially wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly provocative thought to chew on. Something to mull over as you analyze your own portfolio and your own desires.
We have spent the last hour extensively exploring how your entire financial worldview, your risk tolerance, your fears, your definition of success is largely a byproduct of the random decade you were born into, the specific macroeconomic events you physically experienced, and the psychological blind spots of your specific era.
So I urge you to ask yourself this question. What deeply held, completely unquestioned financial biases are actively controlling your wallet right now, today, that will seem completely, laughably absurd to you in 20 years?
What specific strategy or belief are you absolutely convinced is an immutable law of financial gravity today that is actually just a temporary, comforting story you are telling yourself to navigate the uncertainty?
That is a phenomenal, humbling question to end our analysis on. It forces the exact kind of continuous self-reflection and humility that navigating the markets demands.
Thank you all for dedicating your time to joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive.
And remember, the next time you are tempted to harshly judge someone else's seemingly irrational financial choices, or the next time you feel the panic rising over your own portfolio's volatility, just pause and think of the hospital.
Think of the floor-sweeping janitor who retired a multimillionaire and the Harvard-educated surgeon who lost it all.
Financial success is not about your academic pedigree, and it's ultimately not about the math. It is entirely about the behavioral software running in your head. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.